I'm Ramona Koval, and I'm going to be introducing this series of 10 lectures on some of the seminal texts in Australian literature. And we're here because of the actions of a group of students at Melbourne University. In fact, two of them are right here, Stephanie Guest and Anna Hayward, who noticed last year that they'd done 3 years of a literature degree at Melbourne University, and correct me if I'm wrong, they hadn't studied a single Australian poem or Australian novel in those, is that right? Yes. Isn't it grave? It was a grave issue. And they decided to invite some Australian writers and people who are interested in Australian literature along, to come along and have lunch with them on Fridays to see if they could sort of glean something about Australian literature from the guests. So the story got a bit of a run in the press, and I talked to them on the radio on the ABC, and this led to the Wheeler Centre deciding, well, why don't we do our own AusLit lecture series, and that's why we're here tonight. It is shocking that this was the case, but this is the antidote to it. So today we're going to talk about The Getting of Wisdom, Henry Handel Richardson. Now, I'm excited about this. I vividly remember reading The Getting of Wisdom at school. It was a revelation to me, the story of Laura Rambottom's arrival at a school that made her aware of the distinct differences in class and experience and money and values that, as a country girl whose father had died, she has, compared to the girls and teachers at the city school. Well, that sort of echoed with me, rather a big chasm between my working class migrant parents and the sea of mostly Anglo-Saxon faces that surrounded me at school, and some of those feelings of alienation and anger and struggle was something that was shared not just by this particular country girl, but a country girl who'd lived in another century. So these ideas that these feelings could be shared through history. Now, according to critic and Australian literature nationalist Nettie Palmer, Henry Handel Richardson was, and I quote, rigid in her resolve to let her books speak for themselves and to keep all details of the life out of which they'd grown from the public. And I've spoken before on this very stage to Rodney Hall about biographies of writers, and he told me then that he's just interested in the books, not interested in the life at all, but he's going to talk about the book in a moment, and if you haven't read The Getting of Wisdom yet, he's going to take you through the story too. But for others of us who are interested in the lives and personalities of people we read, I'm going to tell you a little about her, despite what Rodney might think.
No, that's a good thing.
Or Henry Handel Richardson, who was born in Fitzroy, just up the road from here, in 1870, to Irish parents who'd emigrated to the goldfields in the 1850s. Her name was Ethel Florence Lindsay Richardson, and she didn't like it. And she took the pseudonym Henry Handel Richardson. Handel possibly because she was a good pianist and she'd lived in Leipzig, and that could have been a bit of a nod to that. Henry Richardson was her uncle's name. Probably she was trying to see whether she could write a book with the name of a man that people would read and might take seriously. She, in 1883, was sent to PLC, Presbyterian Ladies College. The Getting of Wisdom is therefore often called an autobiographical novel because it draws on that experience. She was a good student at PLC. She had crushes on the Malden curate John Stretch, and she had crushes on an older girl at school. Her mother, as I said, took it to Germany on the strength of her musical talent. She wasn't as talented as her mother had thought, and she gave up music for literature. By then she'd met her future husband, John Robertson, who was a scholar in German literature. They married in Dublin in 1895. He afterwards got a chair at the University of London. A lot of his intellectual interests found their way into some of her writing, and even better, he supported her financially and completely. Apparently, Miles Franklin was envious when she visited Richardson's home in London in 1932, having this magnificent man who was looking after her every financial need and taking her seriously too. They had no children. He died in 1933. And then there was also her longtime companion, Olga Roncoroni, who joined the household when Henry Handel Richardson was 26. She never married, and she remained with Richardson until her death and acted as her literary executor. Make of that what you will. Now, Rodney Hall is one of our most eminent writers. He's twice won the Miles Franklin Award and the Australian Literature Society Gold Medal. His 36 books include novels, collections of poems, biographies and social commentary. He's also written libretti and a play. And in 1991, he was appointed for a 3-year term as chairman of the Australia Council. He's going to be our special lecturer tonight on Henry Handel Richardson's The Getting of Wisdom. What we're going to do is Rodney will lecture us, then we're going to have about 20 minutes or so for your questions and your arguments and taking him to task and asking him a bit more about this or that. And for that we'll have 2 microphones, so you're only allowed to speak if you've got the microphone under your nose because we won't be able to hear you. And so why don't we begin? Yeah. Rodney Hall, thank you.
Oh, pleasure. Lovely to be here. So I thought what I'd do, bearing in mind this is not a normal student body, where one would assume you've all read the book, is to build into what I have to say some kind of guide through the book at the same time, plus giving a taste of what her voice was, because it is a novel, and in novels the voice is all important. You could say it is a sort of slice of life from the mid-1880s. A girl goes to boarding school at the age of 13 and leaves at the age of 16, and the book ends with the leaving of school. But that would be, to start with, misleading, because what is central to what happens in the book is the understanding that for a woman in this period, and by the way, I've just realised I haven't switched my mobile phone off, so I'm sorry about that, but I'd better do it in case it rings. What was true for young women in the period was that they had really only one future, and that was marriage. So it is back to Jane Austen territory. It was a hugely important subject. This is not trivial in any sense or sort of light social commentary. It was a desperate matter, and the education that occupies the book, The Getting of Wisdom, that is the book, was really an education in how to survive out in the world afterwards, not in the way it would have been for boys in choosing a career, but in making oneself agreeable and educated and able to play the piano and be an entertainer in the home, to be gracious, to have good manners. All these things were all to do with the marriage stakes. And so the girls in the school, in the course of the book, are all rivals of each other. So their rivalry, although it takes often the form of competitiveness in terms of their results in exams and their results in piano lessons and so on, is actually more than that. It is actually that they're testing themselves against each other as rising women who are going to be, as it were, in the market for men in rivalry with each other. So underneath all of it, there is this, it's like a kind of tidal wave under the book. There is this passionate desperation to know who, for the young woman we're following, Laura, this passionate desperation to know where she's going to fit and what her chances are going to be, and what liberties she's going to have left, because she knows that she's going to have to surrender the major things to the husband. They all know this, all the girls know this. So the book begins with a portrait of Laura at home, with her mother and her smaller siblings. The little girl Pin, who's known as Pin, P-I-N, her younger sister, is the peacemaker because Laura is in permanent warfare with her mother. They obviously love each other, but they're such disparate personalities that they rub each other up the wrong way the whole time. And this war, I'll give you a little quote from the book which embodies this state that they lived in. What's happening is that Laura is due to be sent to school in Melbourne. It's possible that Henry Handel Richardson's model for the house was a house she'd lived in briefly in Chiltern, which those of you who know it is up near Wodonga on the goldfields. And Mother is a sort of genteel, poverty-stricken gentility is what her mother is about, and she makes money by doing embroidery, although in the course of the book we never actually find out what she embroidered. But what we do see her doing a great deal of is dressmaking, although Mother firmly denies being a dressmaker, which would be beneath her dignity. Anyway, in this case she is making a dress for Laura to wear on the journey to school. And she'd sewn all day and was hot and tired. "It's too short," said Laura, looking down. "It's nothing of the kind," said Mother, with her mouth full of pins. "It is. It's much too short." Mother gave her a slight shake. "Don't you contradict me. Do you want to tell me I don't know what length you're to wear your dresses?" "I won't wear it at all if you don't make it any longer," said Laura defiantly. Pin's chubby, featureless little face lengthened with apprehension. "Do let her have it a tiny bit longer, Mother dear," she pleaded. "Now, Pin, what have you got to do with it, I'd like to know?" said Mother, on the verge of losing her temper over the back folds which would not hang. "I'm going to school tomorrow, and it's a shame," said Laura, in a low, passionate tone that never failed to exasperate Mother, so different was it from her own hearty fashion of venting displeasure. Pin began to sniff in sheer nervous anxiety. "Very well then, I won't do another stitch to it," said Mother, now angry in earnest, and got up and bounced out of the room. "Laura, how can you?" said Pin, dissolving. "It's only you who make her so cross." "I don't care," said Laura rebelliously, though she was not far off tears herself. "It is a shame. All the other girls will have dresses down to the tops of their boots, and they'll laugh at me." As you can hear from that, it's a very transparent style, quite in contrast to some of Henry Handel Richardson's other books. This one aims at a voice of direct simplicity in order to deal with the realities of the child's life. So the next thing we have is one morning her tin trunk is packed and labelled, and she sets out on the Cobb & Co. coach to get to the railhead to catch the train to Melbourne to attend a fictional college called Melbourne Ladies' College, which she situates in East Melbourne, somewhere near the hospital. It looks from the descriptions of the park. And then we get an interview with Miss Gurley, G-U-R-L-E-Y, who is the headmistress, who's extremely grand and can't be addressed directly by the students without an introduction, tends to look over her glasses at them, and is generally a martinet. And Laura immediately puts her foot in it by being kind of frank and friendly with the headmistress, and that won't do at all. So she starts off by getting off on the wrong foot and having to retract. And this goes on really for 200 pages. Laura persistently puts her foot in it with one person after another and persistently has to retract. But all the time she is actually growing, and we're watching her grow as a very fascinating person. So her life of misunderstandings and taunts begin, and we're in the school and we meet a gallery of the teachers who leave a good deal to be desired from the academic point of view. And then we have a gallery of the students who are Laura's contemporaries and she sees as being her refuge from the staff, but who in fact turn out to be, on the whole, pretty competitive, not to say in some cases vicious. She does make friends, but her first friends are at the lowest rank, and we all know this from those of us who had to change school many times. Going to a new school, the new student, unless they have very special abilities, tend to aim for the bottom in order to feel at home and gradually work their way up. And we have to sort of ask why we're interested, why we, the reader, are interested in this progress. It was summed up by H.G. Wells, who was somewhat older, I think about 12 or 13 years older than Henry Handel Richardson, and became a friend of hers. He wrote to her about it, saying, "I've been reading your Getting of Wisdom with enormous admiration. Your little rag of a girl is a most adorable little beast." And that's actually pretty good, because that's really, the little rag of a girl is what she is. She's very proud and she's very assertive about her opinions, but she's also humble and modest in her own way, and she's very easily injured, but she bounces back. And so as she goes through from one adversity to another, she is an adorable little rag. She's also a totally convincing portrait. A girl who takes refuge in laziness and rebellion when in fact she's clever and she's skilled at piano playing and the various things she's learning at school. She is in a sense indolent. She refuses to cooperate and she's totally miserable. And early on in the book, her godmother invites her back to her home in Paran for a weekend, and this is going to be escape from the school, except that when she makes, and it's quite a major journey by horse carriage from East Melbourne to Paran, and when she gets to Paran she discovers that godmother's home is a great deal more miserable than school, and so when she actually gets back to school after the weekend, she does so with relief. And it's a sort of turning point because she begins to have a perhaps less passionate view of her differences with the other girls and begins to move up the ladder of friendship towards people that she has genuinely something in common with. What they're all, of course, busy doing, these girls, is speculating about men, because they know that this is what their education is preparing them for. And the men that come their way are neither that impressive nor that frequent, but there is a headmaster set above Mrs. Gurley, who's the supervisor. There is a curate, and the curate is the subject of a good deal of speculation by the girls because he's handsome, but married to, as they put it, an old woman who has a beak nose. And then there are various other prospects of younger men and boys at boys' schools, which actually they have very little to do with and see very infrequently. And then one day after church, a new friend of hers, Tilly, drops a bit of a bombshell, and it's like this. "My cousin Bob's awfully gone on you." Laura gaped at Tilly in crimson disbelief. "But I've never spoken to him." "Doesn't count, he's seen you in church." "Go on, you're stuffing." "Word of honour, and I've promised him to ask Aunt if I can bring you with me to lunch next Saturday." Laura looked forward to this day with mixed feelings. She was flattered at being invited to the big house in town where Tilly's relatives lived, but she felt embarrassed at the prospect, and she'd not the least idea what a boy who was gone on you would expect you to be or do. Bob was a beautiful youth of 17, tall and dark and slender, with milk-white teeth and Spanish eyes, and Laura's mouth dried up when she thought of perhaps having to be sprightly or coquettish with him. On the eventful morning, Tilly came to her room while she was dressing and eyed her critically. "Oh, I say, don't put on that brown hat, for mercy's sake. Bob can't stand brown." And it turns out that we can't stand Bob. But nothing comes of it. But here's the first experience she has of how she's going to cope with talking to a male a little bit older than herself. There are all sorts of dormitory speculations, and some of the girls are wild with envy at the contact, and then subsequently Laura manages to get herself, at least in reputation, entangled with the curate. He knows nothing of this, I have to say. And it kind of culminates in her being ostracized within the school and branded a liar, as if she big-noted herself about the curate's interest in her, when in fact he had none at all. And the book reaches a kind of crisis. It's not a dramatic book in the sense that it's structured around the building of crisis, but there is one. And into that situation comes Evelyn, an older girl who invites her to share her dormitory bedroom, and Laura has her first genuine, because Evelyn's older, she's 17, has her first genuine woman friend. And that is sort of closure. Laura is no longer a child. She's attained the getting of wisdom and leaves school. So that's roughly what it is. In structure, as you may gather from that summary, there's no signal event. There's very little cumulative tension. It's low-key. It has its ups and downs. But as I say, what drives it is it's infused with passion. It has this terrific, passionate power that runs under it, and the tone of voice is very true to the scale. The only times that it's sort of awkward, as you will have gathered with that little quote when she says, "You're stuffing," the one thing that does look dated in the book is when any of the characters speak in a kind of slangy, populist way, and that's, maybe it was accurate to the time, but it looks very dated now. Whereas the main text is surprisingly not dated. It's 100 years old. Anyway, ever since the book came out, of course, there's much critical hot air wasted on speculation as to whether it's an autobiography or a novel. Well, she tells us it's a novel, and so it is. And of course, there's a critical difference. And it can be illustrated really by the book that it's most often coupled with in people's conversation, and that is Miles Franklin's My Brilliant Career. Now, that is an autobiography. And so it's a false comparison. It's apples with oranges. Because of My Brilliant Career being an autobiography, we understand that the writer is writing with authority, knowing her own life and telling us what she wants to tell us. If there's something we don't believe, then we don't doubt her character. We just doubt whether we can find her trustworthy. Whereas in a novel, if you start doubting a character, then the book falls down, because what novels deal with is truth. Non-fiction deals with fact, and fact and truth are not the same thing. I mean, very easily illustrated, and no more sensationally in the early days of Nazism, when Hitler in 1928 had finished writing Mein Kampf, and he had a poster made. And the poster read, unemployed 4 million, Jews in Germany 4 million, the reason is obvious. Well, the two figures were not disputed at the time, so perhaps they were facts. Maybe there were 4 million people unemployed, and maybe there were 4 million Jewish people in Germany. But to put them together was not truth, it was a lie. The 4 million people 4 million Jews had not taken those 4 million jobs. Just a simple illustration, but there are lots more subtle ones one could come up with. But there is no reason to assume facts are necessarily connected with truth. Why novels are entirely connected, if they're literary novels, with truth, is because they are appealing to us as the co-creator, us the reader, as the co-creator, and we only go on creating the characters in our heads if they chime with our understanding of human behaviour. If they're not true to how we know people behave, we lose faith in them, we get bored with them, we shut the book and go to something else. So remaining true to a vision of life is the heart and soul of the novel. And this one is distinctly a novel. That is entirely what it is about. You know, another connection that's often made with another writer is Dorothy Richardson, no relative, the English writer who was 3 years younger than Henry Handel Richardson. And she wrote a book set in a music school in Hamburg. She was a British writer. Shortly after Morris Guest, I'll come to that in a moment, of Henry Handel Richardson. So they had a number of things in common, and I think Henry Handel Richardson was quite an influence on Dorothy Richardson. But the difference is that Dorothy Richardson, in her amazing breakthrough novel Pointed Roofs, entered a whole other realm by devising a completely modern structure for the book. It's the first stream of consciousness novel in English, and is 20 years before James Joyce, and long before Virginia Woolf, and an extraordinary achievement. However, the curious thing is that if you're reading those two books side by side, and I did that a few years back, one admires the Dorothy Richardson for its literary daring, and it's a terrific book. But do we care about it? I actually didn't. Whereas the much simpler propositions that Henry Handel Richardson puts to us in The Getting of Wisdom are moving. The book is finally moving. And the essence of that movingness we can look at from another literary connection, Jane Austen's Emma. Because the miracle of Emma, there's two miracles of Emma. One is that, as you will know, Emma is always wrong, and people suffer because she's wrong, and wrong to the point of rudeness in the case of Miss Bates. But we don't lose sympathy with her, which is a very difficult thing to do. On top of which, Jane Austen in that book, and for me it's, you know, it's a hallmark in that it's kind of the first modern novel in English, because she's not just playing with the psychology of her characters. People have done that ever since Rabelais. She's playing with the psychology of her reader. And I do think that The Getting of Wisdom is the inheritor of Emma, because here is Henry Handel Richardson with another young woman who gets everything wrong. But the more she gets it wrong, the more we, her readers, are tested to keep faith with her. So in a sense, we kind of get more bonded to her because she's wrong than we would if she got things right. And nothing, even in the resolution of the book with her friendship with Evelyn, nothing actually comes easily or gives you closure, gives you a sense that that's the end of something. Not at all. The book sort of finishes quite abruptly, and we're left to realize that this is all she's got. This is all she's going to get out of this school in terms of preparation for life. This is it. And we can see straight away how ill-equipped she is to deal with life in her times and the extraordinary strictures under which women lived. And in her own life, Henry Handel Richardson was a very active suffragette, and was part of the Emmeline Pankhurst movement, and very committed to arguing for women's rights and the right to a vote. So she had a kind of political life that bore out what you see in the novel. I would, in sort of making a few closing remarks, any of you who have this new edition, and it's from text, and I have to say, good on them for reissuing a book of this importance, and it's beautifully produced. It has an introduction by Germaine Greer. Well, as a general thing, I have to say, despite the fact that I very much admire Germaine Greer's own contributions to our social conscience, and I think she writes terrifically as a polemical writer, I warn anyone against reading introductions anyway. I think it's much better to go straight into the book. But in this case, I think there's something misleading that I actually want to address, and that is she chooses to praise the Getting of Wisdom by dumping on Henry Handel Richardson's earlier novel, Morris Guest. It's only earlier by a couple of years. Morris Guest is a magnificent book. Getting of Wisdom is a very good book, but Morris Guest is a magnificent book. And not at all is it, as Germaine Greer says, pretentious. It's a passionate book about, it's got a desperation that this one doesn't have. It's about young adult music students of many nationalities gathering in Leipzig. And Germaine Greer has some pretty scathing things to say about the characters, none of which I think are even wildly, they're so wildly off the mark, they're not even relatable to what actually happens in the book. It is a book about a predatory young woman who's an Australian, and the destruction of this young Englishman, Morris Guest, who's desperately in love with her. But what Greer is not comfortable with, apparently, is that the heroine, well, the anti-heroine of Morris Guest is obsessive and desperately in love with a violinist called Shilsky, and is cruel and willfully cruel and completely irresponsible. But it's out of a totally believable, it's really like a sort of Dostoevsky novel. It's got that intensity, and the language rises to it. It's, I have to say, I think it's one of the, kind of 10 best novels that's ever been written by an Australian, Morris Guest. And so if you are reading Getting of Wisdom, and I hope if you haven't read it, you will read it, don't be put off following it with Morris Guest, because it is an even greater book. And it's a marvellous book to undertake, because it's not that long. Morris Guest is about 400 pages. The Fortunes of Richard Marnie, it's too much for me to go into here. It's a massive trilogy, as many of you will know. It has a great and powerful moment in the middle of the third volume. Whether one feels it quite pays back for the effort that goes into reading all that goes before in order for that. But you can't have that moment without having read it. I don't know. I'm in two minds about it. I think it's more ambitious and less successful than her other works. And then there's a short novel called The Young Cosima about Hans von Bülow's wife, Cosima, who eventually married Wagner. And so it's another music novel. But she wrote it later in her life, and I think she'd become, well, by that time she'd already been nominated for the Nobel Prize, but she didn't get, but she had been nominated, and I think she got a little bit grand, and that's not a good stance for a novelist. So I think Young Cosima is an interesting book, but it doesn't measure up to the two early ones. So if you haven't read it, I suggest you do read it, and it's something we can all as Australians be proud of.
Thank you. Well, as I said before, if you put your hand up, our people with the microphones will be able to find you. But I would like to ask you before we do, it's also a novel about being a writer, isn't it? Because it's about storytelling, it's about telling lies and what is truth. And it's also, I mean, why do you think she's using books in it in the way she does?
Oh, that's interesting.
The Bible, there's Hedda Gabler, Ibsen.
There's Hedda Gabler.
There's
Doll's
Nietzsche.
House.
What about the Nietzsche quotes?
Yeah, excuse me, I'll just get my other glasses so I can see people. It's the problem of extreme old age. I need 2 pairs of glasses. Yes, now I can hear you. Yes, well, books, I mean, yeah, I don't, you know me well enough now, Ramona, to know that I'm not gone on the necessity for stories. I think what it is about being a writer, but I don't think that's about telling stories. I think being a writer, what that's about is transmogrifying experience into words that can be reinterpreted back into experience by the reader.
But what does she
drawing on
think
our
it's
own.
about? Because it's all about telling stories,
Well,
isn't it? Telling lies.
But I don't think that's...
Making stuff up, imagining things that aren't there.
Ah, wait a minute. No. I mean, I'm half agreeing with you and half not.
Which half?
Because I don't think... Well, I don't... You see, I don't think the telling of lies is like storytelling. I think, the telling of lies is trying it on in an experience. There's an experience happening, she's in a context, and she says something that's not true, not because she's wanting to tell a story, but because she wants to be liked or she wants to be listened to, or something along those lines. And on your other point, I think that the very interesting moment when she quotes The Doll's House, and she reads, as Laura, the character, reads Ibsen's The Doll's House. Yeah. And she says, what is this rubbish? It might just as well be a book about mother and pin. It's got nothing in it of any interest. And she says that all the way through the play until she finally at the end thinks, oh, but why was I compelled to go on reading? And so she then comes to terms with the idea, and it's spelt out in the book, of realism. And it's, of course, it was the great thing in the 1890s. This was the great new movement with Zola and so on. So that she was very much part of that discourse of what is realism, and of course she was herself a very convinced realist. And as I say, I think it was her downfall in The Fortunes of Richard Marney. If she'd only exercised a more fluid process than the idea, the grind of getting down realism, it might have been a third of the length and 5 times as effective.
And what about Nietzsche before we...
Yeah, well, every chapter has a running epigraph, and every single one of them is from Nietzsche. So she was, once again, in Nietzsche, it's hard for us to recover now 100 years later, but Nietzsche and Schopenhauer separately and for different reasons were just a collective bombshell. The idea that vitalism could be a rationale for being was shocking news to Victorian society. And interesting that where she doesn't actually talk about Nietzsche at all, she calls him in at every chapter. He's hooked in to, and she knows that her readers would know what that's about. It's a dead thing. No, well, not exactly dead, but most readers these days would not know what the Nietzsche is, or what Zarathustra is, or what any of that is referring to. But nevertheless, she did, and she's very, very distinctly calling on it. And she does these things. I mean, she plays these writerly games. Germaine Greer refers to the dedication of Maurice Guest as prurient, or at least inviting prurient speculation is her phrase, because it is dedicated to Louise. And Louise is the name of the anti-heroine who drives Maurice to his death in the course of the book.
Do we know if it's that Louise?
Well, we don't know it's that Louise, but it's got to be. She's a novelist.
Why?
It's got to be. Ramona, it's got to be. She's a novelist. We've got a 400-page novel in our hands all about Louise. And she's dedicating it to some other Louise. She's a skilled writer. She will know to dedicate it to Louise Baedeker, or Louise my friend, or Louise at the CWA, whatever. She will know that she's got to differentiate it. She doesn't differentiate it. There's no question that she is actually, it's her way of saying this woman in this book who is so destructive, who is so fascinating, she's a marvellous character, but never is her fascination separate from her destructiveness. And Louise in the book knows it, and she uses it, and she declares it. Her victims, and they are victims, she's perfectly open with them, saying, don't have a truck with me, I'll just bring you grief. And I think really deeply that vengeful thing is something that Henry Handel Richardson herself deeply admired and probably would like to have been.
What do you make of that last scene where she runs out of the school, you know, when her sister picks her up.
In The Getting of Wisdom.
That's the book we're talking
yes.
about.
No. I was just at that stage talking about Morris Guest. Yes. Well, she does run at the end, and I think, you know, it's just the expression. It's the last element of childhood, is what I think that is.
Is it? Yes, I saw it as running into the future.
She is. Yes.
Like taking her life into her own
She's also
hands.
running out of the past. It's the end of childhood, I think. It's a childish thing, running across the park. And it's a lovely ending, but it is a little elliptical, and it's all the better for that.
Oh, all right. Well, look, who's got their hand up? And who's got the microphone? Yes. Why don't we combine them?
Thank you, Rodney. And your presentation certainly reverberates with my enjoyment of The Getting of Wisdom. It's great. I'm interested that the way you linked The Getting of Wisdom with Miles Franklin and Jane Austen, and I'm can't help thinking of Jane Eyre as well, and perhaps even what Katie did at school, written about the same time, also rather feisty schoolgirls who are on a learning journey. And I'm wondering if you're seeing these as part of a tradition, and if so, is there any contemporary writers who are taking up this tradition of young girls who are struggling at school but learning and growing in some way?
Well, the first part of your question, yes, indeed. I mean, the business of writing under a male pseudonym, as we know, all the Bronte sisters did that. All of them, when they had success, quite quickly had the names restored to their own names, but they took the names of three brothers. So even, you know, Wuthering Heights was not published by Charlotte, but by Currer Bell. And of course there was George Eliot, the great George Eliot, who there was a huge amount of speculation during George Eliot's lifetime about whether that was a pseudonym or not. And she, like Henry Handel Richardson, fiercely defended the pseudonym. There's a quote in the introduction to Morris Guest, the edition I've got, an introduction by Hugh Walpole, who was a British novelist about 10 years younger than herself. He was actually New Zealand born, a very, very successful novelist in his day. But he quotes her fierce determination that she is Mr. Richardson, and his criticisms of the book, which are very favourable, were written in 1922, and she was still referred to as Mr. Richardson in his book. So the traditions you're talking about, there is a very powerful tradition of women writers who wanted to step out of the Jane Austen mould, and Jane, of course, had been able to publish under her female name. They wanted to claim territory that they thought was not allowed for women to write about or wouldn't be taken seriously, and they were probably right. So that was a tradition that I don't think we can extrapolate into today. You know, there are still rights to be won for women, but one of the rights that has been won is for women writers to be taken seriously, and it really stems from people of about her generation. It sort of begins in the modernist period that we get the rise of the people in the generation of Virginia Woolf and Gertrude Stein and people who made a major mark just as themselves. So I think they're two separate things, I'd say, to the question. I think it's an interesting point you make, and also your quoting of some of the other books that might have been around at the time. Of course, it's often the case with writers of either sex that influential books are not necessarily major works, but the books we're introduced to when we're young that speak to us in particular ways. So there's a whole other potential industry in looking at what her influences might have been. But I do agree with you, she was part of a very strong, continuous tradition, and the famous ones were not the only ones, of women using men's names in order to get taken seriously. The interesting thing is which of them then declared that they were not male writers, and she was not one of those. She stuck to her Henry Handel.
Her Henry Handel handle.
Yes.
Another question. Come on, don't be shy. You know you want to ask one.
Yes,
There's one.
Mine's not really a question, but something I'd like to contribute, in that Henry Handel Richardson went to PLC with my great-grandmother, and the story, the bit that you didn't talk about, but it's in the book, of her going down to the coast, going on the boat.
Yes.
She went and stayed in the beach house, which our family still have 5 generations later.
Oh, right.
And we're contemplating the difficulty of renovating that part of the house. I'm on the side that think we should keep it as it was. Others think we should tart it up. But it's a tradition that's gone on in her family, our family, that story of her being down there.
Yes.
And Nettie Palmer came down and worked it all out and agreed with us that it had to be the house that's talked about in the book.
Oh, that's terrific. Well, welcome.
Well, should they renovate it or not?
Probably not. But
Put your hands up. Who thinks it should not be renovated? No, who thinks it should be?
yes.
I think you're not allowed to touch it.
I don't know if anyone else knows the house at Chiltern, because
you have to speak into the microphone.
Yeah.
Tell us about it.
Actually, the reason I'm quite interested in Handel Richardson, and I would say with a lot of these Australian novels, they do get forgotten. And I was with the National Trust for a few years, and they did quite a bit to sort of renovate her, as well as the house. But they covered. They mention it. It's a significant event. I think she's coming up now. It's 100 years since she's passed away, and they're linking. And I think the National Trust are also publicising those books that Text put out. And I really enjoyed that, Richard Marnie as well. But we did Handel Richardson when I was at just secondary school, and I've read it again, and I've really enjoyed it.
Stand up for you?
I've really enjoyed it, and I think I'll read it again. Probably every 5 years. but certainly, yes. Just very very quickly, that you mentioned Marnie. I think that was really her father's story too. So that's quite interesting. That's why they ended up in that situation of genteel poverty. So if people are particularly interested in Handel Richardson, that does sort of explain why she became a postmistress. Her mother. It was very unusual for women to have paid employment in those times, and so it's just interesting. The kind of society we lived in at that time. Yes.
Interesting you mentioned postmistresses. That was one job that was quite commonly given to women. My own mother, who died recently at 102, the generation older than her, my mother went to England. It's a bit like the subject we're talking about. She went because she had a scholarship to London, the Royal College of Music. She went as a singer. And stayed there for a long time till 1949. And when she finally came back, my mother came back to Australia, some years later I offered to drive her to Kangaroo Valley in New South Wales, where she'd grown up. And by this stage my mother would have been in her mid-60s. And the little town she lived in no longer exists. It's not far from Bowral. Or not far from Mittagong, actually, but it doesn't exist any longer. It's called Urunga. But there's a house by the road that she said, oh, well, this is the last thing remaining of the town. This was the post office. And it looked fairly dilapidated. And I said, well, why don't you knock on the door and see who lives there? And my mother, having a sort of training in opera, was never backward in coming forward. So she said, oh, that's a good idea, dear. So stop the car. So out she got, and she knocked on the door. And a long time later, a very old lady came to the door. It must have been in her 90s. And she stood at the door and looked at my mother, and my mother looked at her, and she said to my mother, you're a Buckland girl. And my mother said, yes, I am. And she said, and you're Miss So-and-so. And she named her. She hadn't thought of her for 40 years. And the one postmistress of two sisters had run the post office. And my mother was born in 1903. So these were people a generation older. So they were very much Henry Handel Richardson's age. They were postmistresses at the Urunga post office. So it was obviously one of the jobs women were expected to do, or Yeah.
But on the matter of mothers too, she begins with that argument with the mother over the clothes, and the mother just doesn't get it, does she?
No, she doesn't get it.
She does a purple dress later on in the book, which is just really, obviously, so embarrassing. But there's a point at which you realise that, she feels for her mother. I mean, she's attacked at one stage about somebody knows that her mother's done some embroidery and threatens her with it. Yeah. And there is a sort of sense that you feel that this woman, she's a widow. She's putting this child through school. She's doing her best.
But don't you think that's there? I mean, even in that little scene I read with the argument of mother, I think embedded in that simple argument is reciprocal love. I think there's no question that, a mother's saying, do you think I don't know the proper length for a dress? And Laura's saying, well, you don't. You obviously don't, because it's going to be, it's not long enough, it's not reaching my boots. I think there's already in there, that's what I mean about the novel. It's not about what you can explain, it's about what you can embody. And the novel embodies experience. And although it's never said, although she stands up for the mother, it's quite true. And when there's a sort of slight about her mother, but that isn't. I don't think at any stage in the book there is disloyalty to her mother. She obviously loves her mother, and vice versa. It's embedded in the book that they're never going to get on. They're never going to get it as far as the other is concerned. They never work out how the other works. And little Pin, that's another little gem of a character. The little sister Pin, in the passage I read to you with Pin saying, "Mother dear, make it a little bit longer, can't you?" Pin is a little girl, and in the middle of the book, when Laura's been through half of her schooling, and she's back home, and Pin has become this gawky, tall, sort of ugly, gangly, hopeless, sentimental, and Laura sort of is quite condescending to her. She thinks, poor Pin, And then at the end of the book, when we see Pin again, and this is now 3 years since we first saw her, she's grown up into a young woman, and Laura, or at least she's a teenager, and Laura, seeing her, thinks, ugly old Pin, until another character says to her, "Oh, your sister is so beautiful." And we kind of see that it's just beautiful in that way. That's what I mean by embodying. We don't actually get a description of Pin. We have no idea what she looks like, but we get it through other people's observations and their feelings and the things they say, and what we can deduce from what they say.
What do you reckon about this epigraph? Wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom, and with all thy getting, get understanding. What's the difference between understanding and wisdom?
It's a translation.
Somebody else might know that. Have we got another question? Yes.
Well, I didn't have a question, actually. I did just want to make a couple of corrections to some of the things that were contributed. It's 100 years since Henry Handel Richardson came to Melbourne to do the research for the Fortunes of Richard Marnie this year, and the State Library is recognising that with an oration in October. And it is true that the Richardson family lived in Chiltern at Lakeview, but in fact a lot of the start of the Getting of Wisdom describes the township of Maldon, which is where Mrs. Richardson was the postmistress, and the journey in terms of going to school actually describes buildings that still exist there, as does the post office. So Maldon is it's a National Trust notable town, and has retained that architecture. So it is actually quite possible to go and see a lot of the things, and to visit the houses where they knew other people, the vicarage where the Reverend Stretch lived, all of those places.
Thank you. Yes, and that's another example. Can I just to take up one of those points? That's another interesting thing, because she does take from if one wants to analyse it, she does take from the house at Chiltern the lake. She talks about looking over. You can still go. Anyone who's driving to Canberra or Sydney, it's only a matter of 2 kilometres off the road to go and visit the house. And there's a bench outside. I drive that drive quite frequently, and I never go past without stopping and going and sitting on her veranda. I know she was only there for about 3 years. But, yes, no, it's a fraught thing to try tying, that's my point. I don't think it's productive in any way to try tying a novel to its sources. I don't think it tells us anything, except it's the idea that if you unpick something, it's the mechanical model. If you unpick something or unscrew it, you can put it back together again knowing how it works. Well, no work of art works like that. Works of art are synoptic. They happen simultaneously. All the complexities happen at one moment. And to say this is drawn from there and that's drawn from here actually tells us nothing.
Why do you sit on the veranda?
Well, I sit on the veranda because it's very pleasant and I'm paying tribute to Henry Handel Richardson, not because she used that view of the lake in the book. I just like the thought of her spirit around. But it's not, all I'm saying is the trouble is if we keep looking for verification and we keep saying what are the facts of the matter, we've taken ourselves out of the loop. When you're reading fiction, like any work of art, whether it's looking at a picture or listening to a Mozart symphony, you have to absorb yourself totally in it. You can't keep a significant part of your mind on one side that's busy making critical judgments while you're reading. You have to be in it 100% in order to get what the book is doing. And that's my point. And I think trying to tease out sources is no help to a novel. It may amuse us, but it's no help to a novel.
Yes, no, just get someone behind you because you've had to go, but we might get back to you if nobody else.
Oh, thank you. I was very interested to how you started in drawing that strong thread about the imperative of marriage for women, young women at that time, mainly because I think I must have read it first when I was 13, and it forever is stamped not about that but about the acute experience of adolescence amongst girls in all their, good and bad, and a lot of the bad is sitting there. And I suppose it's always seemed to me that the double edge of the wisdom was that a lot of the wisdom she got was about the appalling cruelty and manipulation that goes on within those institutions and within that sort of adolescent group.
Or the wisdom also of having to keep pulling yourself back and lying and pretending and getting yourself a husband and making your way as a woman in that society.
This is a moment I just have to get.
What have you got? Another pair of glasses over there?
Because there's a great quote for this. In its day, it was reviewed in a journal called the British Australian. And amongst other things, the reviewer said this: "The book is calculated to impress very unfavourably those who do not know that the Australian girl is much cleaner, wholesomer and straighter person than any of the characters portrayed. It is a book we should strongly recommend adults to keep out of the hands of girls."
I should also tell you that to celebrate Henry Handel Richardson and her work, the Henry Handel Richardson Society of Australia is launching its centenary writing competition on the 100th anniversary of her only return visit to Australia in 1912, as we've just been reminded. Helen Garner is going to be the judge of the centenary competition. And it includes two sections, one for adult fiction or non-fiction, up to 5,000 words, with a prize of $1,000 and a box set of 3 volumes of the letters of Henry Handel Richardson, and one for school students, sponsored by Text Publishing, up to 1,500 words. Now, the entries are going to, well, really they only should bear some relationship with Henry Handel Richardson and or her writing life. So she had an immense range of interests, so autobiography, history, the education of women, feminism, for formation of national, international identity, the writer as expatriate, all kinds of things you could write about and still be eligible to enter this competition. You'll find information about the competition at the back. There's some pamphlets, I think. Also, you can find more information on a website dedicated to the Henry Handel Richardson Society. It's easy to remember, www.henryhandelrichardsonsociety, all one word, .org.au. And I should, just before I ask you to thank Rodney Hall for his splendid lecture, I should tell you that next week at the Wheeler Centre we'll be talking about the poetry of Judith Wright. The lecturer is going to be poet and academic Chris Wallace-Crabb. Please thank Rodney Hall for his splendid lecture, and thank you for coming.